Welcome into Words with Wallace. I'm your host, Nick Wallace, coming at you. It is Sunday, January 12th. I hope all of you guys are having a fantastic, super wild card weekend. Yes, big slate for the NFL this weekend, but what are we talking about? We're talking hoops, of course. Lot to catch you guys up on around the association. I know I'm late on this episode. It's been basically an extra week since I should have recorded, so forgive me for that. It's been a tough week for your boy, but we're battling through, and there's a lot to catch you guys up on, so looking forward to that. And very excited to be back in Texas. I know a lot of you guys are probably listening to this podcast on Spotify, Apple Music, wherever you get your podcasts, but do me a favor real quick, just head on over to the YouTube, take a look at the home studio setup that we got here, show some love and drop a subscription to @WordsWithWallace on YouTube. Even got my cat Nancy. She's kind of hanging out in the bottom corner here. Really, Nancy's like more of a daughter than a cat, but we don't need to get into all that. Would appreciate some love on the YouTube nonetheless. And as you guys can tell by the title of this episode, I want to talk about the new first class in the NBA. There's been a ton of amazing matchups, some really great NBA slates over the past couple weeks here. And I think the biggest takeaway that I have from really deep diving as many games as possible over the past couple weeks is just how incredible the Oklahoma City Thunder and the Cleveland Cavaliers have been. And that all culminated in a fantastic matchup this past Wednesday on January 8th that I want to talk about. And really just talk about how these two teams are the new standard in the NBA. Not something I love to talk about. You guys see the Celtics sign in the background. Obviously, big Celtics fan here. But I have to give credit where credit is due, and OKC and the Cleveland Cavaliers have been playing out of their minds. So we're going to talk a lot about that. But we have a few other topics to talk about real quick. We have a lot of injury news, both good and bad, that we need to touch upon. The latest on Jimmy Butler. I really hate doing this. I've talked about Jimmy Butler on like my last 4 podcasts, but the reality is we keep getting new information, and hopefully this is the last time we're going to have to talk about Jimmy Butler until he's actually traded. We had a little bit of a tiff between Lakers coach JJ Redick and, of course, NBA legend Charles Barkley. We had a couple of matchups of Victor Wembanyama versus Nikola Jokic that I want to talk about. And then, of course, we will talk more about the Thunder and the Cavs. So, huge podcast here. Let's get into it and start off with the injury news here on New Year's Day. And again, I know it's been a little bit since the last time I talked to you, so this might be old news. But I did just want to mention that Jaden Ivey of the Detroit Pistons did break his leg in a game on New Year's Day. Kind of a freak play where Cole Anthony was diving after a loose ball, kind of hit him right in the leg, ended up breaking it, and he is most likely going to miss the remainder of this season. The reason that I think this injury is especially relevant, besides the fact that Jaden Ivey's had a pretty great campaign in his 3rd year, he's really broken out and been an awesome backcourt mate alongside Cade Cunningham, but I think the Pistons are actually pretty relevant, right? I think in all likelihood they're going to end up being in the playoffs, or at the very least, very much in the play-in race with how good Cade Cunningham has been. He is absolutely a star at this point in his career, filling up the box score each and every night for the Pistons. Really enjoyed watching their game yesterday that they were able to pull out a win. And right now the Pistons are 20-19. They're the 8th seed in the Eastern Conference. And so I think they're very much going to be in the mix. Now, I don't expect them to actually give whoever they end up facing in the first round of a playoffs a hard time, but it is really notable for a team that had the longest losing streak in NBA history last year to bounce back in a major way. They always had talent, and so between the coaching change and the few offseason moves that they've made and the ascension of Cade Cunningham and Jaden Ivey has put them in the spot that they're in. So obviously sad injury news, but I still think the Pistons are going to be okay. They should still be in that play-in race in the Eastern Conference, and the positive side of that injury is hopefully it opens up the door for more minutes for guys like Asar Thompson, who they took in the early lottery last year in the NBA draft, as well as Malik Beasley and Tim Hardaway Jr., who have given them very solid minutes all season long. Some more positive injury news that we have: the return of Kawhi Leonard, who is, of course, rejoining the Los Angeles Clippers, who have actually put together a really solid campaign. They're 20-17 right now and currently the 7th seed in the Western Conference. And so you look at a team that's very much been able to tread water and had some really great performances all year long, mainly fueled by James Harden and Norm Powell. You look at that team and you're like, hey, if you add Kawhi Leonard to this already pretty competitive Clippers team that was able to tread water without much star power, what does that mean for the Western Conference? Well, I think the Clippers are definitely frisky. I expect them to obviously stay as a playoff team in the Western Conference. I don't think they're necessarily contenders. I know every year, if you can bet on the Clippers being healthy. You might be able to talk yourselves into them being an actual contender. I wouldn't go that far with the Los Angeles Clippers, but I would say they are definitely a threat to upset a team in the first round of the playoffs and ultimately advance to round 2 of the playoffs. I think that's very much within the realm of the possibilities for this Clippers team. James Harden has been playing at a high level. Norm Powell, a guy I've always loved, has broken out in a real way and taken his scoring to a new level, and he's just an all-around threat. I think he's been the best player night in, night out. Even Zubac has like a real case to be made for an all-star in the Western Conference, even though I wouldn't go that far personally. I think the Clippers are solid, and now Kawhi Leonard's back in the mix. He has played in 2 games for the team so far, and he's averaging only 10 points a game on 20 minutes per game. But the important thing, I did tune in for a couple of those matchups, and I would say that Kawhi looks fine, right? Like, if somebody's going to miss that much time, the main thing that you're just looking at is like, hey, how are they moving around physically? How is he on the glass? How is he on the defensive end of the court? He's checking all of those boxes. So I think Kawhi is going to be just fine, and the Clippers are going to be very frisky. And so I just wanted to make note that it's great to have him back in basketball. And it's just kind of funny. Like, it was a huge shock when he came back just because there's never any information that is coming out of Kawhi Leonard's camp. So it was a shock as of like a week ago when he initially returned. Unfortunately, he's since stepped away from the Clippers because, of course, the terrible tragedy going on in Los Angeles with the fires and whatnot. Kawhi is from there, has family there, so he's stepping away from the team to deal with that. So definitely wishing him the best, but we do expect to see Kawhi Leonard return to the court very soon. Another massive star returning in the Western Conference, we have to talk about Zion Williamson, who has rejoined the Pelicans, who are currently the second worst team in the NBA. Only the Wizards have a worse record right now than the New Orleans Pelicans. Zion, in his first game back, he looked pretty good. He ended up putting down like a 360 windmill on a fast break, so I'd say physically he is looking quite all right. Right after that, Zion's only played in 1 game since his return from the hamstring injury, and it was announced that the team actually suspended Zion for 1 game. Again, this is a self-induced suspension by the New Orleans Pelicans, who are suspending Zion because he was late to team flights. This has been a reoccurring problem with the Pelicans and Zion Williamson. So that is a terrible look for Zion. Again, they have like 8 wins right now as we're sitting here in the middle of January. So I'm afraid that the season is absolutely a wash for the Pelicans. They are never going to make it into the play-in race in the Western Conference, but Zion has a lot to prove with this return. Not only are people out there complaining about Zion's availability and all the health issues he's had through the first few years of his career, but now people are worried about his professionalism and how much of a problem he is in the locker room. Zion needs to work on that. Like, he has a lot of haters to silence. Obviously, contract-wise, he's fine. He's under contract for the next few years, but Zion has the opportunity to be one of the best players in a really loaded NBA right now, and that is not an overstatement with how athletic and rare that guy is, and the rate in which he was scoring buckets early in his career was put him at like a pretty historic pace. So we want to just see Zion on the court. Not only is he extremely talented, but he's wildly entertaining, one of the most exciting players to watch in all of basketball. So happy to have him back, but I just think it's such a terrible look with him getting suspended 1 game after he finally returns from a hamstring injury. So hopefully that's a wake-up call for Zion. They do play my Boston Celtics today, so I'll definitely be tuning in for that. And it is just nice to have him back on the court. The final return to injury that we have to talk about is Paolo Banchero. He is back for the 22-18 Magic, who are currently sitting at the 5th seed in the Eastern Conference. 1 game back, and again, Paolo hasn't played since before Halloween. Like, he only played in 4 or 5 games to start the year, and he looked fantastic before tearing his oblique. And in 1 game back against the Bucks the other night, he ended up putting up 34 points in 27 minutes. So I'm going to go out on a limb and say that Paolo is just fine. This guy was balling out of his mind. He really would be on like an all-NBA watch list if he had just stayed healthy. Like, obviously he's below the 65 game minimum, so he's not going to make the All-Star team. He's not going to win any awards or anything like that, but Paolo looks scary to start his 3rd season in the NBA. So really excited for him because the Magic have been super feisty all year long with how they've competed despite all the injuries, and they are missing Jalen Suggs right now due to back spasms, so the list just goes on and on. But now that they have Paolo back, they can very much be frisky in the Eastern Conference. They can maybe even exceed and catch up to the Bucks to get up to the 4 seed in the Eastern Conference. So super excited to see Paolo back. And the final injury news, and this is just a tidbit I wanted to mention because the poor Phoenix Suns, man, they are really struggling right now. And this was a while ago at this point, but I was watching them on New Year's Eve in a game against the Grizzlies, and Bradley Beal actually injured himself flopping, threw himself on the floor to sell a call, and ended up injuring his hip, and he had to leave the game, and the Suns went on to lose a close one to the Grizzlies in that. And now Bradley Beal is actually coming off the bench for the Suns. So they're obviously grasping at straws. The Suns are now like under 500 and they're outside of the play-in picture in the Western Conference, which is pretty scary, especially with how well the Suns started the year. So just wanted to make that note. Maybe a little bit of karma there. I've never been a Bradley Beal guy. And then he injures himself flopping. Now he's coming off the bench. Just had to make note of that as well. Before we talk about some of the fantastic basketball that was been played over the past couple weeks, we had to talk about the drama that took place between Lakers coach JJ Redick and, of course, Charles Barkley of Inside the NBA. The reason I wanted to hit on it is A, it was really funny and entertaining. I think there were interesting points made on both sides. And then B, I've talked about the NBA ratings and just the entire conversation about NBA viewership over my last couple podcasts, so I felt like this would be reasonable for me to break this down as well, even though it's somewhat old news at this point. But it all started with when JJ Redick, and I think this was just a part of his media availability as coach of the Lakers, a Lakers reporter essentially asked him about the NBA ratings and the discourse going on all about it. And JJ said if he was a casual fan and every time he turned on the TV, there were people telling him that the product sucked, then he wasn't going to want to watch that product. And so he's essentially citing NBA media as a whole for the lack of viewership or the decreased viewership, whatever. And I think that's pretty interesting with him having that perspective as somebody that obviously came from the media, right? He's a podcaster as of a couple months ago, right? So he would know a thing or two about NBA media. And even though he didn't call out Charles Barkley by name, Chuck, on the next episode of Inside the NBA, definitely took offense to those comments. He started off by just attacking JJ Redick as coach of the Lakers, citing that JJ is a dead man walking, and basically suggesting that the other coaches of the Lakers in past years did a fine job, and they still got fired because the Lakers stink, and it's a circus with LeBron and all that stuff. And so later on, Chuck did go on to explain that he is not to blame for the decrease in viewership because he is not the one jacking up 100 threes a game. And so I think as an unbiased party here, I understand both sides, and I really hate to just plant the flag right in the middle, but I think both guys are right. And hear me out, because I do have thoughts on this. JJ Redick is right, because I think overall NBA media is not great. I can't lie about that. And I do think he's absolutely on the ball in saying that negative commentary from the media does have a negative effect on viewership, right? When there are people saying that the product sucks, or there are people saying that it's less entertaining, or saying that guys aren't as tough as they used to be, or the league used to have more talent, anything in that vein is not good for the NBA. It's not good for viewership. Just objectively, I believe that to be true. Now, I also hear Charles Barkley, and I think he's right, because Charles Barkley is not to blame either, and neither is anybody from Inside the NBA, because that show is fantastic. It is arguably the most entertaining show in all of sports media, not just NBA coverage. And if anything, that show is driving viewership because I think people really look forward to hearing what Shaq and Kenny and Ernie and Chuck have to say about what's taking place in the NBA. So they're right on that. But the show's not perfect. It really is true that I think the worst parts of Inside the NBA is when Chuck or Shaq specifically, these two are the most likely to do it, are just kind of crapping on younger players. I mean, Shaq's always been like this. You can go back to the beef with Dwight Howard, and he always seems extremely critical of especially young big men and their abilities compared to what Shaq was. And I'm sure if I was Shaq and I was as talented as he was and as dominant as he was, I'd be a much harder person to impress. But it definitely does cross a line when they just seem to be crapping on guys for no reason, or they're criticizing the talent in the NBA, or more so just criticizing of how the game is being played. I think that definitely has a negative effect. Now, in total, it's all worth it, right? I still think Inside the NBA is a great show, but it's not perfect, right? And there's even moments when Kenny's on the board and, he's doing his thing at halftime, and some games he's locked in, but there's other games where you got to admit, it's did you even watch the game in the first half? Are you now just seeing these clips on the big board for the first time? Because it certainly seems that way as somebody who watched the game. So I just want to throw it out there that it is really entertaining, and I think Chuck's response to JJ Redick was perfect as well. It was great TV. It was hilarious to hear him crap on JJ Redick. It got a ton of engagement on social media. It was awesome to listen to, but it does just kind of show that JJ had a good point. Your negative commentary isn't helpful, but the show as a whole is helpful, right? So I think both sides were kind of right, and I just wanted to touch upon that. I don't hate Inside the NBA. I absolutely love it, if you guys couldn't tell, but it serves its place. It's there more so for entertainment. So let's move on, because unfortunately I do have to talk about Jimmy Butler once again. I think this marks the third or fourth consecutive podcast in a row where I have to talk about Jimmy Butler. I don't want to do that. But basically, the situation's done a complete 180 since the last time we talked about it, so I felt the need to address it. Just as a reminder, last time we talked, the day after Christmas, and Pat Riley came out and said that they were not trading Jimmy Butler point blank, period. And so shortly after those comments, the Heat played a game against the Indiana Pacers on January 2nd, in which Jimmy Butler scored 9 points on 6 shots. So I think that that's notable. Obviously, a lot lower usage than what we've come to expect from Jimmy Butler. And he had a lot to say to the media in the post-game presser. The main quote, and honestly, I would recommend looking this up, especially because like the entire segment was like a minute and a half from Jimmy Butler, and it was really insightful. But basically, Jimmy goes on to say that he wants to get his joy back from playing basketball, wherever that may be. And that's a direct quote. I want to get my joy back from playing basketball, wherever that may be. Somebody in the media responded to him and said, "Can you get your joy back here?" And Jimmy Butler said, "Probably not." And that's how the press conference ended. And basically, immediately after that, the Heat suspended Jimmy Butler, again, another internals team authorized suspension, for 7 games for, in quotes, multiple instances of conduct detrimental to the team. So Jimmy Butler got suspended for 7 games. Bobby Marks from ESPN chimed in and said that is $2.35 million in contract losses for Jimmy Butler through that 7-game suspension. So that's notable. And effectively, this 7-game suspension means that Jimmy has played his last game. And Shams, jumped on the report. He's been all over this story from day one, saying that the Heat are now open for business. Like the recent events and comments from Jimmy Butler show that he is, not committed to winning in Miami, and they are now looking to move on from him. And Shams thinks that we're going to get a deal somewhat quickly. So obviously this was like a massive story when it came out like a week and a half ago. At this point, I thought it was really entertaining. It's not necessarily the most shocking thing in the world. Like obviously we had clues that Jimmy wasn't happy, and we felt like the situation was going to escalate if Jimmy didn't get his way, and we've developed to that point. I think the only notable piece of this story that's important to remember is that, again, Jimmy Butler is a free agent, or likely will be a free agent after this season, unless he decides to opt into his player option for next season, which at this point seems unlikely. So that means that Jimmy still has leverage, right? If he is not under a long-term agreement, there's not a lot of incentive for a random team, like let's say the Memphis Grizzlies, who might be interested in Jimmy Butler, but if they don't feel confident that Jimmy is going to sign an extension soon after that trade, then they're not going to make that move. It's just a lot of risk to essentially rent Jimmy Butler for less than 6 months if they're just going to lose him in free agency anyways. So as much as the Heat hate to admit it, Jimmy still has some leverage here. And the teams that he wants to play for are going to be more incentivized to give a larger compensation package in return to the Miami Heat. So I know we've talked about this story a ton, and this is, again, old news. But just to put a bow on this, I did just want to rank my top destinations for Jimmy Butler based on a basketball fit, right? And again, keeping in mind that Jimmy has some leverage in where he wants to go here, I just want to rank the top destinations that I've seen either Jimmy and his camp mentioned directly or some other obvious fits for Jimmy Butler. And let's rank them 5-1 real quick. At number 5, I have the Phoenix Suns. I know Jimmy listed this as one of his primary destinations, but I think the Suns are in a really tough spot right now. They're really struggling. Obviously, they have a lot of on-ball creators, and if a deal were to be made, Bradley Beal's probably going to Miami in that situation. And so you can make the argument that Jimmy Butler's a better fit and maybe he improves the ceiling of that team. I still don't love it. I think the Suns just have way deeper problems than their star players, and adding another unhappy superstar to the mix that now has to gel in a very quick window before the playoffs. I just don't think that that's going to change the fortunes of the Suns. And ultimately, I think it's a pretty bad basketball fit, so I don't love the idea in Jimmy Butler in Phoenix. At number 4, I have the Memphis Grizzlies. Now, I understand Jimmy has not mentioned it, or to my knowledge, his camp has not mentioned Memphis as a destination either. But that being said, I've seen a lot of people mention them as a logical fit. They're plugging them into the trade machine. They have some cap room to work with. So I wanted to talk about Memphis here at this spot. They've gotten incredible production from the wing spot with their second-round rookie Jalen Wells, who arguably is the rookie of the year. But Jimmy Butler would still be a massive upgrade in that spot for a team that's currently the 3 seed in the West. I think they'd have to at least take a close look at Jimmy Butler and talk to his camp, see if they'd be willing to sign an extension. I think it is a pretty solid basketball fit, but ultimately I'm still not going to make Memphis a contender, even if they get Jimmy Butler, because it's been a while since they made a deep run in the playoffs. So I have Memphis at 4. At 3, I have the Dallas Mavericks. I think this team is already positioned as a contender to begin with, and I just think that Jimmy Butler doesn't really change their fortunes all that much. I think PJ Washington and Najee Marshall in those wing spots give them a lot of production right now, and frankly, Dallas already got better after making it to the NBA Finals, and I think their biggest concern should just be getting healthy, getting Luka back, getting Kyrie back. And once they have all those guys back, they're going to be just fine. I don't think they need Jimmy Butler as an end-of-game guy. I think he plays less defense than what he once did. So I think the fit in Dallas, while yes, they're still contenders with or without Jimmy Butler, I don't think it improves the team all that much. So I have Dallas at 3. At number 2, I have the Golden State Warriors. I think they would get a lot better from getting a guy like Jimmy Butler. They've been in desperate need over the past couple years to get like a second option offensively outside of Steph Curry that you can depend on, especially in big games and at the end of games. Jimmy Butler can fill that role. He can still defend at above average level. I think he could play alongside Andrew Wiggins, alongside Jonathan Kuminga. I don't know if either of those guys would be sent back in the deal, but I really like the fit and the idea of Jimmy Butler in Golden State. And then finally, my number 1 Jimmy Butler destination, I have the Houston Rockets. I think this is a team that has surpassed everybody's expectation this season. They have a ton of talent, but the reality is, I think Fred VanVleet is over the hill quite a bit, and he's been their kind of go-to end-of-game guy, and it just hasn't worked all that well. Şengün is their best player, but going to a big man at the end of games is difficult, and so getting a guy in Jimmy Butler who's going to gel really well, at least on paper, with head coach Ime Udoka, who's still going to defend at an above average level, who can be an on-ball creator at the end of a close game. I think that's exactly what the Rockets need, and I think that he would be a great fit in Houston, and he's from Houston. He requested Houston as one of the destinations, so they would be my top choice for Jimmy Butler. So hopefully that is the last we have to discuss Jimmy Butler until he's actually traded, but definitely let me know what you guys think about the top destinations for Jimmy Butler. Now, let's talk about some actual basketball that's been played within the past couple weeks. And I want to talk about Nikola Jokic versus Victor Wembanyama. And again, I know this happened a little over a week ago at this point, but it was so cool to have back-to-back games in which Jokic and Wemby faced off against each other, like literally back-to-back nights as well. On Friday the 3rd and Saturday the 4th, the Nuggets and the Spurs played at back-to-back games. And let me just read you the box scores of how this all played out. In game 1, the Spurs won 113 to 110, and this game was in Denver, by the way. Wemby put up 34 points, 18 rebounds, 4 assists, and 2 blocks, including locking up Jokic on the final possession of the game. Jokic was in like an isolation situation against Wemby, down by a bucket, and Wemby kind of forced him into like that Sombor shuffle, like fadeaway jumper, and Wemby had it on lock. Like Jokic ended up like throwing a pass cross court, and it ended up being a turnover because even he had tried to shoot the ball, it would have gotten blocked. And it was fantastic defense from Wemby. And on the other side of the ball, Jokic ended up putting up 41 points, 18 rebounds, and 9 assists on 36 shot attempts. So again, obviously, even though the last possession did not go the way that Jokic hoped, on the whole, he was still extremely productive and really aggressively looking for his own shot in that game against Wemby. And then the following night, Denver kind of got their lick back. This game was in San Antonio, and Denver ended up winning in overtime 122 to 111. Jokic put up 46 points, 9 rebounds, and 10 assists on, again, 35 shots. So very similar production to what he had the night before. Wemby cooled off a bit offensively, at least with his own scoring. He finished with 20 points, 23 rebounds, 3 assists, and 4 blocks. So again, I'm just throwing a lot of numbers at you, so maybe you didn't enjoy that, but I just wanted to give my reaction as a whole. First and foremost, anytime Jokic and Wemby play moving forward, it just needs to be on national TV. Like, it's so rare to get the best player in basketball, Nikola Jokic, 3-time MVP, going against like the young next up in the NBA. And it's so obvious that Wemby is that next generation's superstar. He's so young. The production he has is ridiculous. They play like a similar position, I guess. It's fantastic. And I should know that this is not the first time these teams have played against each other in a very dramatic fashion. If you guys remember to last year at the end of the regular season in what I believe was the final regular season game for the Nuggets, they played against Victor Wembanyama and the San Antonio Spurs. And if the Nuggets would have won that game, they would have secured the number 1 seed in the Western Conference. And ultimately, that could have changed their entire playoff destiny last year, right? Obviously, Denver gets matched up with Minnesota in round 2. They lose that series in 7 games. If they beat San Antonio that random game in April, they have the number 1 seed. They don't play Minnesota in round 2. Things could go a lot differently. But that game last year was fantastic. These past 2 games were fantastic. So we just need this on national TV moving forward. In addition to the fact that the generational differences and how special it is to watch Jokic and Wemby play against each other. I really loved watching Jokic specifically and just, again, how aggressive he was. Like, again, taking over 70 shots in 2 games for Jokic is so rare that it's not how he prefers to play. It's not how he prefers to win basketball games. But he knew he had the strength advantage over Wemby. And look, it wasn't his most efficient output ever, but he was still getting over 40 points in both games. And it was just insane to watch him create space against somebody with so much more size than him. Obviously, Jokic has that strength advantage. He would just bounce off Wemby, create enough space to score over him time and time again. That was really entertaining. And then on the Victor Wembanyama side of things, I think that those 2 games against Denver showed the highs of Wemby and then also my frustrations with Wemby, right? The first game in which, again, he had the better game in that first matchup. He scored more points. They ended up winning that game. In that first game, Wemby took 16 two-point attempts, right? He had a couple threes in the mix as well, but the vast majority of his shots were inside the arc. The second game against the Denver Nuggets, he took 7 two-point attempts. So again, going from 16 two-point attempts down to 7 two-point attempts. The vast majority of his field goal attempts in that second game were from beyond the arc. And guess what? Wemby wasn't as efficient, the team didn't win, and it just shows how dominant Wemby can be inside the arc. Now, obviously teams are preparing for this. They're trying to prevent Victor Wembanyama from getting comfortable anywhere close to the basket. But when he does, he is unstoppable with that size, with that length. And so it's easier said than done. I'm sure the Spurs have been trying to scheme up easy looks for Wemby all year long. But when Wemby relies on that three-point shot too much, it's just not going to work out well. The Spurs are not that scary of a team if he is settling for jumpers time and time again. Now, I've backed off my take a little bit that he shouldn't be a stretch five. Like, that's obviously ridiculous. And I didn't quite say that at the beginning of the season, but I was disappointed, especially early in the year when the three-point attempts went up from last year and he was shooting only 20% from three. Obviously, that number's gone up quite a bit and he is improving as a three-point shooter, but I just don't think that needs to be his go-to. Like, obviously, he can get open whenever he wants from beyond the arc because of that size, because of how high he releases the ball. But he needs to establish easy shots throughout the game that's going to make the team better, that's going to make him more efficient. And that's just what is preventing Wemby from going to the next level, in my opinion. It's just how many shots he's taking outside the arc compared to the damage he could do if he got closer to the basket every once in a while. So hopefully you guys enjoyed those Wemby versus Jokic matchups this past week, and hopefully we'll have many more of those moving forward. Let's move on and talk about the new first class in the NBA. And now, I wasn't excited to bring you guys this segment, obviously, as a Celtics fan here, and as the Boston Celtics are still the defending champs, they are very much contenders. They very much belong in these conversations. But the reality is, Oklahoma City and Cleveland have been dominant this season. They've been in their own tier as far as production in this regular season. If you look at the record, that's what it says. And if you really just watch the games over the past couple weeks, you will see that as well. And it all culminated in a fantastic matchup on Wednesday the 8th, in which Oklahoma City had to travel to Cleveland to play the Cavaliers, and both teams were riding big on winning streaks. It was an awesome game, and we'll talk more about that momentarily. But let's just dive into these teams a little bit more. One thing that both of these teams share, and you guys can let me know if you feel differently, I did not feel like either the Oklahoma City Thunder or the Cleveland Cavaliers were real contenders last year. I understand OKC, especially, they were the 1 seed in the Western Conference. Some people might have argued that they were contenders. I honestly never felt that way. And we'll talk more about what changed and what has made Cleveland and OKC ascend to that point this year. But safe to say they're definitely contenders this year. I'm definitely putting that to the side, and they've been fantastic. So let's start off with Cleveland, who is 33-4 at the time of recording. They're 6.5 games ahead of the Celtics for the 1 seed in the Eastern Conference. OKC, they're 31-6. They are 6 games ahead of the Rockets for the 1 seed in the West. And mind you, OKC has been missing Chet for most of the season, so that is insane to think about. And Cleveland is currently on a 15-game win streak. Spoiler alert, they ended up winning that game Wednesday against the Thunder, and they lead the league in field goal percentage, three-point percentage, and offensive rating, and they're also second in net rating and 11th in defensive rating. And if you look at the Cavs from last year and you're just wondering what has caused this massive increase in production, right? Why are they so much better this year than what they were last year? It's kind of funny that roster-wise, like, nothing really changed with them. The only thing that you can really point to is, I guess, Ty Jerome. He was on the Cavs last year, but he only played in 2 games. I don't even know how long he was actually on the roster or suiting up or whatever, but he's been like a real part of the Cavs rotation this year, and I don't expect that to change even with guys like Max Strus and Isaac Okoro who are back in the rotation for Cleveland. Ty Jerome has just been too good, especially in that game on Wednesday. He was kind of the hero for the Cavs. So roster-wise, really no changes to speak of besides that. Obviously, the Cavs had the coaching switch going from J.B. Bickerstaff to Kenny Atkinson. Now, obviously, Atkinson deserves a ton of credit. He's been fantastic, and objectively, he is doing a better job coaching this Cleveland Cavaliers group. But J.B. Bickerstaff, not a scrub either. Like, he's actually been great for the Pistons that we talked earlier about, who are likely going to be in the play-in race in the Eastern Conference. So that is definitely a change, and it's difficult for me to evaluate how much credit to give coaching in all this. It's just a variable that's really tough to measure. But if you just watch the Cavs, I think the biggest difference in their play is the ascension of Darius Garland and Evan Mobley. Starting with Garland, like, he was always been a really good player. He was a highly drafted player. He showed a lot of promise in his first couple years, but I think the difference was last year he was injured a lot. I think he broke his face, weirdly enough, against the Boston Celtics. I think he ran into Kristaps Porzingis, broke his face, mouth wired shut for a while, lost a lot of weight. He was not himself all year long. Like, the shooting from the field was down, the three-point shooting was down. He did not look confident out there, and he has been a revelation for the Cavs this year, especially in end of games. I think he's one of the league leaders in clutch scoring. He, oddly enough, has been their closeout guy, even though they have arguably a more talented player on the roster in Donovan Mitchell. Garland's just been that good. And then you look at Evan Mobley, who that's a guy who has consistently gotten better every year he's been in the NBA, but I think expectations have been so high for Mobley that maybe we didn't see that as the case. People are always wanting more. People are wanting that three-point shooting to come along. People are wanting that offensive playmaking to go to another level, and that just hasn't been the case. But that doesn't mean he hasn't gotten better. Like, he's already an extremely good defender. He already makes great reads with the basketball. He's a decent, okay, mid-range jump shooter, whatever. But both of those guys have been fantastic. And I think the final piece of what has changed from the Cavs is security around Donovan Mitchell. If you look at Donovan Mitchell's counting stats, they're basically all down. His usage is down a little bit. That's because the other players in the team have stepped up a little bit. And it doesn't seem like Donovan Mitchell's upset. There have been no storylines about where he's headed in free agency, where he's getting his next contract. All that stuff has been put aside. Donovan Mitchell has been extended. Donovan Mitchell seems happy in Cleveland. And just there being no negative press around Donovan Mitchell is enough for that to be an improvement over what it's been in years past. If you guys remember, there was a lot of rumors about him going to the Nets, rumors about him going to the Lakers, rumors about him going to the Knicks. All that has been silenced. So when you combine all of these things, Cleveland is dominant. They've always had a fantastic roster, and they're really deep, like they're 10 or 11 guys deep. And I think the funniest piece about all this, and like the biggest gripe that people had about Cleveland Cavaliers the past couple years, is people, including myself, saying that they need to split up Evan Mobley and Jared Allen. People saying like, hey, Mobley showed the most promise offensively from the center position, which is still true and something I still believe, by the way. So they need to split it up. They need to get rid of Jared Allen. I wonder if in like a couple of years, especially if Cleveland like wins a title or at least contends for a title, makes an NBA Finals, whatever, I think that argument of the people that are saying to split up Mobley and Allen could look like a much more watered down version of the argument that people should split up Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown, right? That's something that was recycled a lot and thrown back in a lot of people's faces after the Celtics won that title last year. And they look really stupid now. I'm glad I was never in the camp to split up Tatum and Brown. I am, however, in the camp to split up Mobley and Allen, or at least I was. What we all forgot, and everybody, including myself, who made the argument that Mobley and Allen need to be split up, is that even though that might all be right about Mobley and his production and his best position being center, we're just overlooking the fact that Jared Allen is really fucking good. He is awesome. And especially in that game on Wednesday, he was dominant. Like, obviously, he's not an outside shooter by any means, but like his rim protection, his athleticism, just the touch he has around the basket is remarkable. I think, and just to go on a little tangent here real quick, like big men as a whole, and especially non-shooting bigs, the touch that I've seen from big men this year in like floaters and like kind of mid-range and push shots, hook shots, whatever, I've been so impressed with. I feel like I've paid more attention to that in guys like Zubac, guys like Jared Allen, guys like Isaiah Hartenstein for the Thunder. Even though they can't shoot the ball from the outside, that does not mean they do not have immaculate touch around the basket. And some of these shots, hand in the face over another big man that they just drill consistently, is so impressive. There's like, again, that just represents the skill level across the NBA as a whole. Like Jared Allen has that. He is fantastic. And it would just be really hard for Cleveland to quote unquote win any trade in which they trade away Jared Allen, because he likes to be there. He's a great personality. He's clearly an extremely talented player. And it's just really unlikely that they are going to get somebody in return, even if it allows them to move Mobley to the center, that's going to make that team better. Especially because if you look at Cleveland's roster as a whole, they don't really have a backup center. Like, they just kind of stagger those minutes between Mobley and Allen when they have to, or they could maybe play like Dean Wade or something like that as like a small ball five if they needed to. But for the most part, like, they don't have a backup big. So it is what it is, and Mobley and Allen are probably going to be the future of that position. And then moving on to a quick deep dive on Oklahoma City real quick. They had a 15-game win streak heading into the game on Wednesday against the Cavs. I put win streak in quotations because let me just say, as much as I think the Thunder are fantastic, that win streak was complete bogus. People were saying, oh, they've won 15 in a row, and Cleveland had won like 10 in a row at that point. It's a great matchup, which it was. But we all watched Oklahoma City lose a game in the NBA Cup Finals a couple weeks ago. Like, that happened. And just because of that unique situation where that NBA Cup championship doesn't necessarily count in the record books, it's like its own category, and obviously the players wanted to win because of the financial incentives and all that stuff. That's great, but it didn't ultimately count for the stats. And so ESPN and other media companies out there are parading around this win streak for OKC, but we all watched them lose a game within the past couple of weeks. So I don't count that. I'm sorry, I hate to say it. I'm glad they didn't win that game on Cleveland, and I'm glad this record did not advance to the point where that became its own NBA record of consecutive wins in a row, because that would have been a massive asterisk with that NBA Cup game in the mix. Now, putting that to the side, the Thunder have been dominant. They've been really impressive, again, especially over the last couple of weeks. On the season, they lead the NBA in net rating and defensive rating and free throw percentage. A lot of that goes to Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, who gets to the line a million times a game. They're also 7th in offensive rating. Now, the question to ask what has changed with OKC is a lot easier to answer with OKC than it is Cleveland, right? They obviously added Isaiah Hartenstein and Alex Caruso in the offseason. In real time, those moves looked awesome on paper, but the Hartenstein move in particular, like, I cannot give enough credit to that move. Hartenstein has been so much better than my wildest expectations, and I think almost anybody's expectations. Like, the fit of him in OKC is seamless. From his very first game with the team, he was the perfect rim protector. He was amazing on the glass, which is exactly what OKC needed. Like, if you look at their team, especially just like the heights of all their players, they're low-key like a pretty small team, so they really needed like a dominant physical presence down low. They can run offense through him, his decision making, his work on handoffs, his work in like that mid-range push shot area. It is all fantastic. And that guy works so hard. Like, it's just so weird. Like, he was awesome last year for the Knicks, right? Like, really great. People in New York really valued him. They would have held on to him if it wasn't for like the new salary cap, new CBA, all that stuff. He would still be a New York Knick, no questions about it. But for him to step into a new team coming off of an injury to start the season, and immediately all of his counting stats are up, he's playing even better, he's producing at a higher level, like, you just have to be thrilled if you're a Thunder fan with that Isaiah Hartenstein signing. Caruso, he's been solid, right? Like, obviously his main contributions are going to come on the defensive end of the court. Offensively, he's still really limited, but he does fit in perfectly with exactly what OKC has going on, which is the best defense in the NBA. Despite the lack of size, like guys like Cason Wallace, Lou Dort, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, Jalen Williams, they are all fantastic defenders. And the way they are all collectively bought in, and the fact that even when they bring in guys like Wiggins and Kenrich Williams and all these random dudes off the bench, they're still super bought in defensively, and they play every passing lane. If you watch the first quarter of a Thunder game, you're going to see at least 2 or 3 passes just get picked off and taken the other way for an easy layup, because teams are not ready for that difference in defensive intensity coming from the Thunder than what they've experienced their previous 5 games, right? It's just so different. They're so bought in defensively. So Caruso does fit in really well, and I do expect him to be a valuable contributor once he is healthy, but they're not going to need 30 minutes a game from Alex Caruso. He's probably going to be sitting around 20 minutes for the remainder of the season, because they're getting a similar level of production in their starting lineup already. And I think the biggest change with OKC, and why I'm taking them more serious as a contender, is that experience, right? I said it last year on my playoff preview and everything like that. It is so rare for a team to come out of nowhere and just win an NBA title. Now, I know the Thunder, if you were paying attention to previous seasons, like, they looked really good. Shai was obviously a star, so it wasn't super surprising to see OKC be good in the regular season, but I don't think many people picked them to be the 1 seed in the West last year. Like, that seemed pretty surprising, even in real time. And despite the fact that they were the 1 seed, I did not expect them to win a title. I just find it so far-fetched for them to go out there and just win 4 consecutive playoff series. I didn't pick them to beat Dallas because I knew Luka, Kyrie, those guys in Dallas, they just had more playoff experience. And it takes one real run where you come up short before you guys really get it and buy in and understand that playoff intensity. And that may sound cliche, and I'll never understand as somebody that's never even came close to the NBA, but I do think that's a real thing. And now that OKC has that experience under its belt, they are going to be a much larger threat heading into the playoffs this upcoming season. Now, let's top things off, talk about that game on Wednesday. I don't need to go through every single play because it is old news for a lot of you guys listening at this point, but the game was awesome, right? The game is in Cleveland. The media coverage around it was great. It was really exciting to have 2 teams that are red hot meet like this. And I would just say that my biggest takeaways were the combination of Mobley and Allen took over that game for Cleveland. They were fantastic. The 2 bigs dominated the paint. Both teams actually surpassed over 100 points by the end of the third quarter, despite the fact that both teams were playing defense at a high level. So the game itself was fantastic, just back and forth, a million lead changes throughout. But the deciding factor was in those non-Isaiah Hartenstein minutes specifically for OKC. That is where Cleveland made up a lot of ground. Like the lineups with the other Jalen Williams and Kenrich Williams, whatever, they could not compete with Mobley or Allen, especially Jared Allen in that game. Like, they were just fantastic. And the fact that Cleveland was able to survive and win that game despite a horrible shooting game from their best player, Donovan Mitchell, who finished the game, he shot 3 of 16. I don't even think he had his first points to like the closing seconds of the first half. So he was basically a non-factor in that one. I do think Mitchell gave a little bit more defensively than what I'd seen from him in previous games, which makes sense given the stakes. And Ty Jerome was the hero off the bench for the Cavs. He had like 15 points. He had a great plus minus. He really helped swing that game, especially in the fourth quarter. And that's notable that Ty Jerome is still going to get minutes despite, again, Max Strus and Isaac Okoro, who have recently come back from injuries. And kicking it over to OKC, just final thoughts, even though they came away with the loss. We know Shea is like the most consistent player in the NBA. He's inevitable. He's like a guaranteed 30 points. So I thought it was really nice to get a big game out of Jalen Williams. He's a guy who, on paper, is probably the Thunder's second best player. And if you're looking to poke holes in that team, you'd probably say, is Jalen Williams ready to be the second best player on an NBA championship team? Maybe not. Maybe Chet steps up into that role when he's healthy, whatever. It's almost a certainty that he is going to be that on-ball creator, that second creator outside of Shea. Jalen Williams has to fill that role. And frankly, he wasn't great in the playoffs against Dallas. It makes sense. Again, his first real playoff experience, second year in the NBA. And it is just ridiculous that they're getting this type of production from a guy who was a late lottery pick. Like they just hit on that draft pick right away, and he is only in his third year in the NBA. So he had a really nice game for OKC, outside of a couple bad turnovers, but whatever, that's going to happen. And I think long-term, my biggest takeaway with OKC is I'm still more scared of OKC as a Celtics fan. Obviously, Boston would still be my pick to come out of the Eastern Conference, even though the Cavs are firing right now. But you look over at OKC, and you know they're getting Chet back, you know they're getting Caruso back, and you also know that they have this like treasure chest of picks that they're just sitting on, right? Like, if they wanted to get frisky, they could make a move at the deadline. I don't even know what they need at this point, right? Like, I think the best move is to do nothing, but eventually, like, they're going to have to start making moves and consolidating some of that picks because they are sitting on a massive haul of assets. So long term, I'm still much higher on the Thunder, even though they lost that game on Wednesday. And then finally, just to put a bow on this, even though OKC and Cleveland objectively have to be in that first class for this season of the NBA, yes, the Celtics are still contenders in my book. If you have them any lower than 3, I think you're just trying to be hot takey. If you want to make the argument they should still be the odds-on favorite, which they very much might be, to win the NBA title, I don't disagree with that either. I think the Celtics in their playoff experience, that is a different conversation. But for the sake of this regular season, OKC and Cleveland have been the best. I think you probably have to put Dallas in that contender tier too, just because of their moves in the offseason. All of the new pieces that Dallas brought in are playing really well right now. They just need to get Luka and Kyrie healthy. And I think you're going to look at least 4 contenders with the 2 teams that made the finals last year, plus OKC and Cleveland. So that is going to do it for this podcast. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this pod, as well as a couple awesome weeks of basketball that we've had. I know it's been a while since I had a guest on, and I swear at the end of like every single episode at this point, I'm teasing the same 2 things. Either I'm bringing in a guest or I am doing the tier rankings. But now that I'm finally home, now that I'm finally caught up, getting back on my normal schedule, I do plan on either bringing in a guest or doing a tier ranking, which I, of course, rank all 30 teams in the NBA, sort out the contenders, which we did a little bit on this podcast, but also the teams that are one piece away, the teams that are in the middle, that are frisky, some teams that are tanking at the bottom, all that stuff. It's always great to do a deep dive on all 30 teams, and now that we're roughly at the midway point in the season, I think now would be a good time to do it. So that is going to do it for this podcast today. Be sure to follow @Words with Wallace on everything. That includes Spotify, Apple Music, wherever you get your podcasts. Also, support the show on social media. That includes @Words with Wallace on YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and TikTok. If that's still a thing, might get banned. Not really up to date on that situation there. Be sure to give the show some love on social media. So that is it. I will talk to you guys next week. Peace.